All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Joe Matessa, and I am the owner of BrainTune Columbus. And we're here to talk about healing therapies for concussion and traumatic brain injury recovery. I am pleased to be joined by my colleague, Megan Colombo, who is a registered nurse and a school nurse and a certified practitioner with BrainTune, and Dr. Mark Tommerdahl, inventor and lead scientist of BrainGauge with Cortical metrics. This webinar is being recorded, so I will ask that all of you please enter your questions into the chat. And at the conclusion of our presentation, we will stop the recording and we'll go ahead and open up that moderated chat for discussion to get all your questions answered. Right. So here we go. So as you know, concussions and TBIs can occur at virtually any time throughout the stages of our lives, and they can vary greatly in their severity. Some of the symptoms that are most commonly associated with concussions and TBIs can include dizziness, headaches, sensitivity to light, anger, impulsivity, lack of emotional regulation, physical and emotional fatigue, sleep disruption, difficulty with planning, organizing, and focusing, lack of energy, drive, and productivity, difficulty with balance, vision and hearing impairment, and issues with memory. And, particularly with concussions, they don't show up necessarily on MRIs or scans, so they're really hard to diagnose. And navigating the services and our healthcare system can be quite complicated and daunting. And you'll often find that the symptoms will last much further than when you're released from care. And so you're left with symptoms and you're not having a diagnosis or a treatment plan to continue to support them. A little bit about what we do here at BrainTune Columbus is we offer cutting-edge brain performance therapies that really support healing from the inside out. We have two primary therapies. One is IASIS Microcurrent Neurofeedback, MCN, and BrainGauge cognitive technology. Both of them are safe, they're non-invasive, and they are drug-free. At BrainTune, our therapies can actually support a very wide range of conditions. As we don't treat the condition itself, we activate the brain's neuroplasticity to heal itself. And so some of the conditions that we support are anxiety, concussions and TBI, emotional regulation, executive functioning, fatigue, PTSD, sleep issues. And you'll see that many of these conditions are also the symptoms that are experienced with concussions and TBIs. The first therapy that we offer is IASIS Microcurrent Neurofeedback. So traditional neurofeedback has been around for about 50 years now, and it's otherwise umbrellaed under biofeedback, and it uses the electrodes that you see pictured there that read the brain's activity while you're actively watching stimulus on a screen, and that stimulus is triggering the neuroplasticity in the brain. The typical traditional neurofeedback therapy will get sustaining relief in about 30 to 60 sessions. Microcurrent neurofeedback has been around for about 15 years now, and IASIS Technologies is one of the leaders in that space. And it can actually achieve that same sustainability in less than 20 sessions. The way IASIS Microcurrent Neurofeedback works is that it gently prompts your brain and to reset and rebalance itself using low-level electrical signal, which encourages the brain to release those stuck patterns. It's kind of like rebooting your computer or tuning a piano. The microcurrent neurofeedback is otherwise known as transcranial electrical stimulation. And it is not the shock therapy that you may have heard of in the past. It is completely safe. The current is 1/1,000,000th of a cell phone battery wave, 3/1,000,000th of a watt, and has no side effects in 15 years. So it is perfectly safe. The science behind IASIS MCN has really great results. What you're seeing here is a pilot study that was done with the University of California, San Diego, and you'll see 6 participants there. And in that study, using military personnel, they saw a 54% reduction in abnormal brain waves and a 53% reduction in post-concussive symptoms. The second technology that we use is called Brain Gauge by Cortical. Also completely safe. It is highly effective for concussion and TBI recovery. It is a simple, non-invasive tool that measures how your brain is functioning over time. It uses gentle vibrations in what appears to be a mouse that accesses how well your brain processes information. Brain training exercises that you do after the initial assessment can help improve performance, helping you to strengthen focus, processing speed, and overall mental fitness. There is a home unit that also allows for convenient practice about 15 to 20 minutes a day, 3 to 5 days a week for overall effectiveness and sustainability. I am extremely pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Mark Tommerdahl, who is the inventor and lead scientist of Brain Gauge. Dr. Tommerdahl is a BS in biology from Davidson College. He has an MS and PhD degrees in biomedical engineering and mathematics from the University of North Carolina. He joined the faculty in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at UNC, and he's been there until he retired as a professor. He is the co-founder of Cortical and has over 140 peer-reviewed publications. And I'm sure that doesn't even touch on your success, Dr. Tommerdahl. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to tell a little bit more about yourself and then talk about Cortical Brain Gauge, and how it relates to concussion and TBI recovery. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that you can go ahead and share yours.
Okay, thanks, Joe. It's very flattering. So let's get started on here. And yeah, I recently retired from University of North Carolina, and the Brain Gauge has quite a history that parallels mine. So while I was working on my master's and PhD in a neurophysiology lab, we were studying how the brain worked. And, one thing about the brain is that you can study, interactions within the brain in an animal model at very high resolution that you really can't study it in the human model or things like Brain Gauge. And so what we were studying there was like, how does the brain work, and how do different interactions contribute to what we feel, what we perceive, and we know that we knew that those perceptions would change with any kind of injury. And so, basically, after about 20 years of just doing the animal model, we started doing the human model as well, and we would do them in parallel. And the way we did that was we started stimulating we stimulated the skin in the lab on the animals. We just stimulate 2 points on the skin and vibrate those places on the skin and cause interactions in the brain. And we could activate very specific places in the brain. And by doing that, we could also do the exact same thing in humans or people in our human model. And when the very first time we did a sensory perceptual test on individuals, and just basically that means vibrating the skin on the fingers and just asking very uh, fairly rigorously, what do they feel like, which stimulus is bigger, and doing the same thing in animals, but asking them the question by sticking electrodes in the brain. We got a 98% correlation. So that's a basis for doing parallel studies. And that's sort of the basis for the brain gauge. And what you see up here on the screen is a picture of the brain gauge. And you see the title is The Lab in the Mouse That Targets Brain Function. Everybody calls us a mouse. So now we call it a lab in a mouse. It's a brain gauge. These little tips here, they vibrate. This doesn't act as a mouse, but what this has done, this has lost 100 pounds in 20 years because it was extremely hard to get not just the miniaturization of the electronics, that was not that difficult, not nearly as difficult as the mechanical components that can vibrate your fingertips. That's fairly big. And so what we do is we do studies here where we actually generate some kind of report from delivering stimuli to skin. And what exactly kind of measures do we get? Well, the brain gauge is a systems measure, and it's a systems measure that targets functional building blocks of information processing. And so that's really, and so these building blocks of brain function and connectivity, and that's things like processing speed and focus and lateral inhibition, plasticity and timing. And those building blocks are what virtually everything else is built on. So if you try to build a house out of crummy building materials, then you've got a problem. Or if those building materials start, they start losing their integrity, then things start falling apart. Same thing is true of the brain. But the cognitive processing is up here, then executive function, language and learning, they all depend on the basic building blocks. And there's really no way around that. Now, one thing that we do is that we're making measures of the brain function. And a lot of people do online cognitive tests, and we won't mention names but they are, when they do that, so they do self-report where they're asking someone how they feel, or they're doing some type of questionnaire that requires cognitive processing or executive function to do those tests. Well, the problem with that is you're using a broken brain to evaluate a brain. The brain is really good at evaluating a broken leg. You can look down and say, yep, my leg's broken. I got a bone sticking out. Need to fix it. But when the brain's broken, it's a terrible tool for evaluating what's going on. So we target these basic building blocks both when we're testing and when we're doing exercises. So it's the same thing. So how is that graphically distributed? What does that look like? What you do is we vibrate the fingertips, and then we basically activate these different parts of the brain, and we target these functional mechanisms. There's very specific mechanisms of brain function, and some of the vibrations that are sent to the fingertips can be complicated, but the person taking the test only has to answer simple questions. It doesn't depend on language, and it delivers very high fidelity stimuli. So, this is at micron resolution and sub-millisecond accuracy. So what does it look like? Well, this is the result of 20 years of research. And what we did was we made a research tool that's very successful. And that research tool, we also took another step and made it user-friendly. By user-friendly, I mean red is bad, green is good. And you can see that like day one after concussion, it might look like, this is one case study, might look like this. Day 6, everything looks better. And day 14 looks much better. And you can inherently tell that things look better just because, well, there's a lot more green down here than there is over here. Well, over here, where the concussion was, you can see that's even easier to look at. That plot is from the cortical metric that is derived from all the other measures. All these measures target different functional mechanisms of information processing. They're all different, and that means there's specificity in this particular type test. Now, there are 3 basic applications of the brain gauge. One is a standard measure, and that gives you all the specificity. And how do we use it? Well, this is a 15 to 20 minute test. And the brain gauge standard is basically, you do that first test during an initial consult or right after somebody gets injured. You do a quick, this 15 to 20 minutes test to see what do they look like, what are the issues. And then each time you see them, or each time, every day for that matter, you do the 90-second quick check. The 90-second quick check doesn't give all that specificity, but it does a very good job of tracking overall performance. And then after, in between, or after testing or treatment, we also recommend using the brain gauge gym. So after IASIS, when people are treated with things like IASIS, there's a period of hyperplasticity right after the treatment or intervention, and basically that's a really good time to do the brain exercises. And so the brain gauge gym is a really good place to build connectivity. All those measures that we do are measures of connectivity, and all the exercises that we do are exercises of connectivity. And a lot of people take these home units and do exercises, and they have quite a bit of success. So what kind of neurological conditions has the brain gauge been demonstrated to be sensitive to? Well, lots. But today we're just talking about neurotrauma, things like concussion and TBI and stroke and PTSD, but mainly concussion and TBI. And so let me give you a couple examples. Here's tracking recovery from concussion. Here's tracking recovery with, and that's just no interventions. And this case is subconcussive. So one thing to know about concussion and TBI that people don't realize is if they get hit, then it doesn't result in a concussion, it often results in a little dip. And so this was from a study done at Pendleton. We're evaluating special forces guys handling heavy artillery, and we test them before and after they've handled heavy artillery, which results in sub-threshold activation or sub-threshold concussion, really. But if they had gotten multiple hits, multiple days, it can lead to a concussed-like symptoms. So anyway, we'll skip over the black mold exposure because obviously black mold is not a good thing, but it does look a lot like a TBI. Anyway, here's a few examples, and this is where somebody was doing hyperbaric training, and then when they started doing the brain gauge gym, you can see that they got much better. That's a case of TBI. This is just passive recovery, and that takes sometimes 3 weeks to have passive recovery. One thing that IASIS does is really speeds recovery up. And basically, when you combine IASIS with the brain gauge gym, you accelerate progress. In this case, the brain gauge gym was initiated at this dotted line. This person had PTSD and severe anxiety, and they had some ozone and hyperbaric dives as the intervention. But then the brain gauge gym promoted that, as basically promoted recovery. This is not all case studies result in graphs, and this is a case where somebody we just met him a few weeks ago. He just came and just provided this testimonial, was that he discovered he had actually been using the brain gauge gym in his the brain gauge rather, in his medical practice. He retired from his medical practice and got a TBI, and then he just picked up the brain gauge and then started to use the gym. And he didn't, it would have been nice if he'd taken tests along the way, but basically the first time he used it, he said, oh, it's broken. So he sent it back. And it was kind of interesting because I remember when he sent it back and I was like, no, this is fine. We sent it back to him and he goes, oh, I'm the one that's broken, not the brain gauge. And so what that means is his reaction time was so slow that it didn't register. And he started using the brain gauge gym, and he started getting better. And all of a sudden, he's back to normal. He's fully functional. We won't go into the second part of that story because that's about his 81-year-old mother, and it was just helped with her dementia. The brain gauge gym does. Again, building connectivity is the key to, and rebuilding connectivity is the key to just about any brain injury. This is just another case where you can track treatment efficacy, And there was no brain HGM involved, and this was with pulsed electromagnetic field, another electroceutical. IASIS is in that same category of electroceuticals, but personally, I think this, IASIS plus brain HGM is proving to be a really effective tool, and combining the two is really, really good. This is PCS patients treated with pulse electromagnetic field. And the reason I put it up here is that the reason that you monitor and look at these things is because all patients recover at different rates. They all have different initial conditions, and they all recover at different rates. So notice here at pre-treatment, look at the difference between the conditions. Over here, obviously, this person's much worse than this person. This person that was much worse took 1 month to get better. And that tracks his symptoms. That tracks how much better he got. This person took 5 months. So the reason you can't just say, how do you feel to somebody, you need to track their progress. And we've done many studies in concussion. This was a result from 400 in a sports concussion study on this site, looking at a sports concussion study of several hundred student athletes. And generally, this is sort of the average of what you see. Normally, initial assessment will look poor. Full recovery should look something like this. They should be fully recovered before they return to play. Now, the important thing to remember is there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of measures out there, and some of them don't work very well. For example, this is when the concussion occurred. Number 2 is when the student athlete was actually cleared to play by balance testing. And this is across all subjects. The average was they did not just manage to equal their pre-baseline injury. They were actually 15% better than their pre-baseline injury. So balance testing is really only, it never works for a concussion. It's not measuring brain health. This is when they pass. This is the average pass. They pass on impact. And there's a lot of literature out there that cites this. Typically it takes 7 days to pass the impact. But that's sort of typical of many online cognitive assessment tools. So remember from that first picture I showed you about online assessments, online assessments requiring executive function and cognitive function. Well, that's what you're testing. But, if your executive function, cognitive function is okay, you can pretty much start learning how to do those assessments. It's not testing the building blocks, and you can actually cheat on some of those tests. This is when the average day was for clearance for physicians. But, this is when individuals are typically fully cleared because they match, and that actually parallels neurophysiological studies where there are injuries in animals, and you actually can do very invasive procedures to see if they're better. This over here is a different study where we compared it's called receiver operator characteristic curves, but the brain gauge had an accuracy. What it means is brain gauge had an accuracy of 0.93, and that's what this funky curve here looks like. But all the other measures in that study, there were 12 other measures in that study, basically fell into this gray zone. None of them cracked 60%. On this particular thing, an ROC analysis, the worst score you can get is 50%. It's the same as flipping a coin. So basically, we outcompeted everybody in that study. So, and the main reason we outcompeted a lot of the studies, a lot of other methods rather, is that the brain gauge targets biological function, and it goes through those fundamental targets through those fundamental building blocks. Many other methods target symptomology. Symptomology is like, do you have a headache? Are you dizzy? So, those things are true, but that's the kind of self-report you get. This is just an interesting slide to throw up here just because we still do research, and, we're looking at what's the impact of heavy artillery. We see, after 30 minutes, 6 hours, 24 hours, 72 hours, 72 hours is full recovery. And then we compare it to the blast overpressure that the subject sees. But we have been outperforming people in a lot of number of studies, different types of studies, different types of neurological disorders. And so the big question is why? And this is about an hour-long lecture to go through. So I'm not going to go through it all. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Number one, I already told you, it targets brain function rather than symptoms. The technological capability is far superior to consumer-grade electronics. So if you're not familiar with the consumer-grade, that terminology, you are familiar with what a laptop is, what a cell phone is, and that is called consumer-grade electronics. For example, average reaction time for the last 175 years is 200 milliseconds. That's for healthy people. However, consumer grade electronics, if you use a cell phone to measure reaction time, you automatically add at least 400 milliseconds. Just think about that difference. So 200 versus adding 400. So, that's just not accurate. Somatosensory system. The somatosensory system is the sense of touch. And that is the highest, that is a very high fidelity system. And the way to think about this is when you touch the skin, and touch those or vibrate 2 points on the skin, you're vibrating 2 places in the brain. When you try to do a test or something flashes on the screen and you look at it, there's a lot of peripheral stuff going on, and it's different from one environment to the other. And then also we implement in the brain gauge gym, we implement modern training techniques, and that's a whole nother story. But what I'll do is I'll stop here and basically say, if you want to spend a whole day learning about the science behind the brain gauge, you can go to the brain gauge workshop, but there's a lot more information and it's always changing. Up here, I have 120 publications. There's actually quite a few more, and there's a lot of videos on the YouTube channel. And so anyway, I'm going to turn it back to Joe, and thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Tommerdahl. I'm going to go ahead and reshare again. And I think this would be a good place to pick up as we talk about kind of the connection of IASIS, Microcurrent Neurofeedback, and Brain Gauge. They are separate technology companies, but in your experience, as you mentioned, they work well together. You want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I mean, the brain gauge first, when you do IASIS, think of it this way: you're rebooting the brain, and it reboots or resets it. And this is, if you always think about physical analogs, you can think of this as sort of IASIS is doing a gentle massage of the brain. It's like a sports massage. And then when you do the workout in the brain gauge gym, it's basically like doing a workout, and you're strengthening connections. And so it's that simple, first, but a lot of times when somebody comes in and they've got specific issues like concussion, it's a little bit more like a cramp, muscle cramp, and you really need to help release and reset the brain. And then again, brain gauge does help reconnect the pathways.
So Megan, earlier on, we talked about some of the symptoms that are typically associated with concussions and TBI. As a school nurse and a certified IASIS practitioner, what type of protocols do you typically follow in the schools? What do you see as far as symptoms go? And how do you see the IASIS Microcurrent Neurofeedback and Brain Gauge supporting those symptom recovery?
Yeah, so I wish we could have this in the school because it would be so effective. We follow something pretty simple, and it like you were saying, we follow we kind of are they're self-reporting their symptoms. At least for me, I know they're seeing their physician, and we also usually involve our trainer. I am a nurse in a high school, but I will follow up with the students daily in the beginning, just to give kind of a number of where they are with certain symptoms, and report that back to our district psychologist and our trainers, and then they will report also to their physicians, and they kind of all work together to kind of we're basically just trying to see when they can be back to learn and back to play, return to learn, return to play. So my job is basically to start with them and have them self-report to me. and then I report what I'm also seeing in them. But it would be fantastic to have something like this that would back it up with hard evidence, as opposed to just saying, well, I'm feeling, my dizziness is at a 5 today and my headache's at an 8 and whatnot.
If I can interject, I've worked with a lot of athletic trainers,
Yeah,
and the stories I get back are pretty interesting. And it's
I'm
usually
sure.
revolves around something like, student athletes will say, I'm ready to return to play, I'm fine. And the athletic trainer will look at their scores and say, no, you're not.
Right.
You're still having headaches. And then the student athlete is just in shock. How did you know? And so
Right.
it's nice to have an objective measure for those situations where, everybody wants to return to play and they really want to ignore their symptoms in so many cases, but
Right.
it's important to do it.
Yeah.
And because it's self-reported, you're really just relying on their word. And if they're more motivated to return to play or to return to school than what they are physically ready for, then it's not going to be an accurate reflection of whether they are or not.
No, not at all. And I have to rely on that when I'm in my own, what I'm seeing in them, because I don't have this in my office. So
Yeah.
this is fantastic.
Very good. All right, so let's go a little bit further here. And whoop, that's not where we wanted to go. Okay, so let's talk about typical protocol. All right, so with typical protocol, they would come into BrainTune for a free consultation and a first treatment, and that takes about 2 hours. That consultation includes a full client intake of their medical history and their goals for healing, the brain gauge assessment, and their first IASIS MCN treatment. The typical course of treatment that follows for IASIS MCN is 20 treatments. And that will typically happen over a period of 6 to 8 months. And that cadence looks like 3 to 4 weeks, you go 2 sessions a week. 4 weeks or so, you go 1 session a week. For a couple months, you go 1 session every other week. And then you go once a month until your 20 are completed. And what you're really trying to do is build sustainability between sessions. So if someone's not lasting a full week from one session to the next before they start feeling symptoms again, we're not going to jump them to every other week. The whole goal is that every IASIS treatment builds upon itself. And I think that's where the brain gauge gym really helps support that, because if you're doing that brain gauge home unit in the home for 15 to 20 minutes a day, 3 to 5 days a week, it will accelerate that recovery process and support the activity that's happening in that IASIS treatment. As far as cost goes, the treatment packages are fairly set at 12 treatments for $1,500. That might be used with someone that is only dealing with, say, a concussion. If you're dealing with a lot of the other symptoms and conditions that the microcurrent neurofeedback will support, you will typically do a 20 treatment package, which is $2,300. And then we have the family package, which is 40 treatments, and that can be shared among 2 people in a family. Then the brain gauge home unit is sold separately. That is $650, and that will allow all members of the family in the household to use the unit. You can use it every day if you want, for as long as you want. That unit is also connected to my online platform, so I can coach and monitor your progress and make sure you're staying on track. So, as Mark Tommerdahl tends to position it, it's kind of like the brain gym, and then I'm your personal trainer. So I'm going to kind of hold you accountable, make sure you're doing it as often as you should be, work with you on the kind of results that you're getting and what your goals are, and making sure that we're getting that healing journey the way you want it to be. Since the brain gauge does only work on a PC, if you do not have PCs at home, then you will need to get a tablet. That is an additional $300 extra. Unfortunately, none of this is covered yet by insurance. However, it is HSA and FSA eligible. So we can go ahead and give you receipts with CPT codes that you can process it with your HSA and FSA. And lastly, here is the BrainTune team. We are here and we are ready to support your journey. It is Chris and Megan and myself. And you can go to braintunecolumbus.com and click on book your free consultation to get